Hey guys, tonight, we're stepping into a world where silence rules, sandals slap on cool stone, and the only thing louder than your yawns is the echo of a distant bell. You're entering a medieval monastery somewhere in the heart of Europe, around the year 1275. The halls are dim. The candles flicker just enough to show worn wooden beams and rough plaster walls. You walk slowly, deliberately, trying not to let your boots squeak. Because here, time isn't measured by ticking seconds or flashing phones, but by sacred rhythms, echoed chants, and very, very well-timed naps. You'll follow the monks as they rise in darkness, pray half asleep, tend to herb gardens, copy dusty manuscripts, and yes, doze off between prayer bells. You probably wouldn't survive this schedule. Most people today would fold after one pre-dawn wake-up call. But the monks, they thrived on structure. Especially when that structure told them exactly when they could get some shut-eye. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this Canifer Nuri, sleepy little community reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink against the candlelight as you step into the scriptorium. Parchment rustles, a monk coughs politely. Another scribbles Latin in the margins of a weathered book with the intensity of someone trying not to fall asleep. You find a corner and sit. The air smells of beeswax ink and old wool robes. Everything feels soft and muffled, like the world has been wrapped in thick felt and told to speak more gently. Life here is built around order. And not just any order, the kind that feels ancient and immovable. The monastery is a bubble of predictability in a world otherwise ruled by famine, war, and wayward goats. Inside these stone walls, time has been tamed, portioned out like honey, measured sweet, and doled out with a wooden spoon. It's all thanks to a thick old rule book, penned nearly 700 years earlier by a man named Benedict. Now you don't meet Benedict himself, he's long gone. But his spirit lingers in every corridor, every meal, every midnight alarm. His rule, capital R, set the tone for thousands of monasteries across Europe. It's the medieval version of an all-in-one life planner. It tells you when to pray, when to eat, when to read, when to be silent, and most importantly for us tonight, when to sleep. Historians still argue whether Benedict actually intended his rule to be followed so literally. Some say he was outlining ideals. Others think he was just trying to prevent monks from wandering off or arguing about chores. But regardless of intention, his schedule stuck. And so you, the novice, the guest, the poor soul who didn't drink enough herbal tea before arriving, must now live by it. A bell tolls, not the loud clanging kind you hear in cities. This one is smaller, softer, a single iron voice bouncing off thick stone. You look around, no one flinches. They all just glide to their feet. One monk raises a finger to his lips. You follow, the line out of the room through shadowed corridors to the chapel, and so begins the first of 8 daily prayers. It's called vigils, and it's held while the rest of the world sleeps. Depending on the season, this might be at 2:30 in the morning. You sit on a wooden bench that feels much colder than it looks. Your eyelids get heavier with each chanted psalm. You're not alone. There's a kind of synchronized drowsiness here, a shared agreement that being half awake still counts. You might be wondering why the obsession with 8 prayers. Why break up the day so much that sleep becomes a logistical nightmare? Well, the idea was to pray without ceasing, to sanctify the whole day, to let no hour pass without a nod to the fort haute divine. But it also created a very real problem. How do you know when to pray if you don't know what time it is? Before clocks, that question was a real headache. Monks used natural cues, the angle of sunlight, the temperature of the air, the feeling in their bones. Some relied on candle clocks where wax burned at a consistent rate. Others used water clocks that dripped in rhythm, assuming no one bumped them. And yet with all this ingenuity, one constant frustration emerged. People kept missing prayers, or worse, napping through them. Thus, the obsession with precision began. But don't worry, for now, after vigils, you get a break, kind of. A few monks slip away for quiet reading or contemplation. Some may head to the garden to inspect frost-kissed cabbages. Others might catch a tiny nap, if quick. You, still wrapped in that soft half-sleep trail behind a brother, carrying a lantern that creaks with every step. He's humming gently, almost tunelessly. And for a second, the monastery feels less like a fortress and more like a lullaby. Later, you'll learn that even naps must be earned, that sleep is sacred but not indulgent, that monks view drowsiness as both a challenge and a calling. But for now, you just let the shadows stretch long across the cloisters, your breath rising, like incense in the cold air. The bell will ring again soon. You hear it again, that soft iron bell. This time it doesn't startle you. It arrives like a gentle nudge, a reminder rather than a command. You rise slowly, your body unsure if it just finished sleeping or, barely, to begin. That's the thing about monastic life. It blurs the boundaries between waking and dreaming, between work and worship, between rest and duty. As you shuffle down the corridor, your mind drifts to the man who started it all. Benedict of Nursia, born sometime around the year 480, just after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. A chaotic time to be alive, unless you were into lawlessness, barbarian invasions and diseases with names no one could pronounce. Benedict wasn't into any of that. He preferred caves. Legend says he fled to a hillside cave in Subiaco to escape the distractions of city life, which back then included murder, famine, and really bad plumbing. There he lived in solitude, praying and reflecting for 3 years. 3 years alone, a cave. Even the most dedicated introverts among us might reconsider after day 4 without coffee. Eventually people found him. They asked him to become their spiritual guide. He was reluctant at first, but then he started organizing communities of monks. That's when he wrote his famous Rule of St. Benedict, a little Latin manual that would quietly run Europe's spiritual engine for centuries. The rule wasn't flashy, no long-winded philosophy or elaborate theology. Just practical, deliberate structure. When to rise, when to eat, how to behave, and crucially, how to pray. It divided the day into clear chunks, opus dei, or the work of God spread across 8 canonical hours. The idea was simple. No part of the day or night should go unblessed. But the execution, that's where things got tricky. Historians still argue whether Benedict meant for the rule to be followed literally or just as a general framework. Some abbeys interpreted it with mathematical rigor, adjusting their daily schedules to the minute. Others were more relaxed, shrugging off exact times and just making sure no one napped through Mass. But either way, the rule's influence was enormous. It spread like beeswax on warm parchment, shaping the routine of monastic life from Italy to Ireland, from Spain to the snowy edges of Norway. And in that routine, sleep became something sacred but also something suspicious. Too much sleep. Sloth. Not enough martyrdom. The perfect amount. A divine balance. And to strike that balance, you needed to know when exactly to open and close your eyes. Back in your monastery, that structure plays out like a well-rehearsed play. You attend lauds, the morning prayer held as light begins to filter into the chapel. The chant echoes off the walls, both soothing and a little chilly. Your kind stomach reminds you that breakfast is still an hour away. You ignore it. After lauds comes a short reading session, then a bit of manual labor, maybe helping Brother Odo dig compost or stack firewood. He's strong, quiet, and walks like a man who's measured every step. Since 1197, you mimic his pace, wondering if your body will ever feel as calm as his face looks. Then comes breakfast, usually something simple, bread, a little cheese if the cows were kind, maybe a soft-boiled egg if someone bribed the cook. You eat in silence, punctuated only by the occasional throat clearing or the creak of wooden spoons against clay bowls. Even eating is governed by the rule. Meals must be sufficient but not indulgent. Conversation should be minimal or replaced entirely by readings from Scripture. And there's always a designated monk reading aloud while the others chew. You feel bad for him. He doesn't get to enjoy his cheese warm, but he does get the last laugh. He's the only one who can sneak in a joke without breaking the silence. You're getting into the rhythm now. It's not just about following bells, it's about surrendering to a pace of life so measured that your brain eventually stops fighting it. You stop asking what time is it, and start asking what prayer is next. The rule of Saint Benedict was a clever thing. It used time not just to organize life, but to spiritualize it. If the bell rings, you pray. If the bell stops, you work. If the sun's gone and the candles are lit, you sleep until the bell calls. Back again, the rule turned time into devotion. And in doing so, it quietly planted the seeds for something that didn't even exist yet. The modern clock, because here's the twist. These monks, so devoted to the spiritual world, were also accidental engineers. Their obsession with prayer schedules led them to track time with greater and greater precision. When sunlight and dripping wax, no longer, cut it, they began tinkering with weights, pulleys, gears, and eventually mechanical marvels. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, you simply marvel at how something written over 500 years ago still holds this place in its palm. The rule isn't just a document, it's the heartbeat of this monastery. And in that heartbeat, you hear something comforting, predictable, gentle, a rhythm steady enough to fall asleep to, or wake up by. You rest on a bench in the cloister as the breeze moves through arched windows. The stones beneath you are cold, but the sun is warm. A bell rings far off. You smile. You have absolutely no idea what time it is. And that's kind of the point. You're starting to lose track of how many bells have rung already. That's perfectly normal. In fact, it's practically encouraged. Because in this cloistered world, time doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the divine, or more specifically to the divine office, the series of 8 daily prayer times that shape everything in this quiet universe of stone walls and wool robes. The monks call them horae canonicae, the canonical hours. You just call them bells. But they're more than just reminders to drop your rake or close your book. They are the skeleton of monastic life, the drumbeat that turns chaos into calm. The first prayer of the day, vigils remember, starts in the dark. No birds yet, no warmth, just sleepy chants and flickering candlelight. Then comes lauds at dawn. By now you're slightly more awake, though still not sure if you've actually slept or simply hallucinated a few psalms in Latin. Next is prime, around the first hour after sunrise. Though, that depends on the season. Don't worry, someone with a candle clock is probably tracking it. Then come terce, sext, and none, roughly mid-morning, noon, and mid-afternoon. These are the daytime prayers. They might interrupt your gardening or your manuscript copying, or your highly spiritual daydreaming. But they're short, sometimes so short you wonder if the monks aren't just checking in with God like a divine voicemail ping. Yes, still here, still holy. Please leave a blessing after the chant. After none, the shadows grow longer and your stomach grumbles again. Vespers arrives with the setting sun. It's the most beautiful service often, with longer chants and golden candlelight bouncing off polished chalices. The air feels plush, breathlesses, sacred, the protings, hush deeper. The voices richer. You feel something stir inside you, not quite understanding, not quite boredom, just stillness. Finally, there's Compline the Night Prayer. It's peaceful, soft, a lullaby in Latin. Sometimes monks sing the Salve Regina, and it echoes in a way that makes your skin tingle. Then the bell rings once more. Not for prayer, but for silence. The great silence, they call it. No talking until morning. You lie in your cell on a hard straw mattress. Your blanket smells faintly of herbs and dust. And for a moment you wonder, how did they keep track of all this? Because medieval Europe, let's be honest, wasn't known for its punctuality. There were no clocks on kitchen walls, no pocket watches, no chiming phones reminding people to hydrate or stretch. If the monks were going to pray 8 times a day and wake up in the middle of the night to do it, they needed a system. Before gears and escapements and ticking hands, monks relied on what they had: the position of the sun, the color of the sky, the behavior of birds. Some monasteries use sundials mounted high on south-facing walls with Latin hour marks, carved like tattoos into the stone. Useful, sure, unless it was cloudy, or night, or you forgot which season it was, and accidentally rang the bell too early. Others turned to candle clocks. This was low-tech genius. You take a tall, thick candle, mark it at regular intervals, and note how long it takes each section to burn. Want a 30-minute nap? Burn a third of a candle. Want to wake up? Brother Giles at 3 a.m. Leave instructions on which notch the flame should reach before he gets smacked with a goose feather. Reliable. Not always, but creative. Definitely. There were also water clocks or clepsydre. These used a regulated flow of water to fill or empty a container. You could mark the vessel and tell time by how much had leaked out. Again, assuming no one tripped over the pipe, or drank the water, or forgot to refill it. But the real secret, gut feelings, monks got good at this. If you chant the same psalms every morning for 30 years, your body becomes a clock. You don't need to count the minutes. You just know. Ah yes, this psalm takes exactly the time it takes for the shadow to cross that particular crack in the floor. Historians still debate how accurate these early timekeeping methods were. Some claim monks were off by hours. Others believe their internal rhythms were more precise than we give them credit for. After all, when your entire day prayer, tend to notice when the sun shifts a little too far, or the candle guttered too soon. And here's something delightfully odd. Some monasteries trained certain monks, specifically as time trackers. These were the brothers with the most regular sleep patterns, the best internal clocks, or just the lowest tolerance for missing breakfast. They'd be given the night watch tasked with waking everyone for vigils by sheer instinct, or by sneaking around with a tiny lantern and a suspiciously accurate hunch. In places like Cluny or Monte Cassino, where monastic discipline was particularly rigorous, this kind of informal clock-keeping became an art. Entire manuals were written on how to ring bells appropriately, which is code for not too early, or the abbot gets cranky. Of course, the question still lingers, why so much effort? Why torment yourself with midnight prayers and weird water clocks when you could just sleep until the rooster crows? The answer is woven into the idea of sacred time. Monks didn't want to live by the world's clock. They wanted to live by God's clock. And in their minds, that meant creating a schedule so orderly, so repetitive, so reverent that every hour would become a kind of whispered prayer. You settle back onto your straw mattress, the candle flickering low. Outside, another bell tolls softly. You've lost track of how many times today it's called you to rise, to kneel, to reflect. But you're starting to understand why. It matters. Time here isn't measured by minutes. It's measured by moments of devotion, of breath of stillness. And yes, of naps. The bell rings again. Soft, predictable, as if it's part of your breathing now. You don't rush to move. Nobody does. In a monastery, time doesn't chase you. It waits patiently, folded into every archway and tucked between every syllable of chant. You're starting to understand something important before mechanical clocks. Time wasn't carved into equal chunks. It bent. It flowed like candle wax down a brass holder. It changed with the season, the sky, and the prayers. Let's talk about what time actually was in the Middle Ages, because spoiler alert, it wasn't 9:00 a.m. sharp. You've probably grown up thinking of time as neatly sliced into 60-minute hours, each one identical, but in the medieval monastery, those hours weren't equal. They stretched and shrank with the sunlight. In winter, when daylight was short, the monks' daytime hours zipped by. In summer, they sauntered along lazily like a cow on a hot road. These were called unequal hours or temporal hours, and they were the norm for centuries. A canonical hour of prayer might last 45 minutes one day and 70 minutes the next. That's because monks divided the daylight into 12 parts. No matter how long or short the day was, midnight. Not always at midnight. Sometimes it meant the middle of the night, which could be anywhere from 11:00 p.m. to 2:00 a.m., depending on the season and latitude. It's like a math class, designed to induce naps. So how did they cope with this squishy concept of time with routines, memory, and a shocking tolerance for imprecision? Most monks just felt it. If you'd chanted lauds every morning for 40 years, you didn't need a Rolex to tell you it was time to chant again. Your bones knew, but there were those who wanted more tinkerers, planners. Maybe even the occasional overachiever monk who thought, there must be a better way to know when I can nap. This is where things get quirky. Some monasteries tried to keep track using monastic time boards, rudimentary wooden charts that showed prayer times for each season. Others used incense clocks, where a line of perfumed powder burned slowly and predictably, leaving a trail of scent to mark the hour. Imagine your alarm clock releasing lavender when it's time for nun relaxing. Yes, accurate. Well, if the wind wasn't blowing, still, as helpful as these methods were, none of them solved the monk's biggest challenge: nighttime. Without sunlight, sundials became fancy paperweights. Candle clocks worked, but only if someone remembered to light them and not let Brother Gerard knock them over in his sleep. That's when the truly sleep-deprived geniuses stepped in, brothers who began experimenting with ways to track time without natural cues. The early seeds of mechanical thinking were being planted. These monks weren't inventing clocks for money, glory, or even science. They were inventing them so they wouldn't accidentally sleep through prayer. Or worse, sleep through the right to sleep. See, napping wasn't just allowed, it was practically regulated, but only during specific windows, and only if you'd fulfilled your duties. The monastery wasn't a spa. It was a holy machine, and everyone was a cog, albeit a very sleepy cog in a wool robe. Historians still debate how widespread these early time devices were. Some argue that most monks remained blissfully analog, praying by intuition and guessing by starlight. Others point to documents from the 10th and 11th centuries, describing increasingly precise methods for counting time in the dark. In some monasteries, bells were rung, not by humans but by weighted levers attached to rudimentary clockwork. Yes, robots rang the prayer bells before it was cool. You walk now through a shadowed corridor where moonlight slips in through a narrow lancet window. You pass a wooden wheel with a stone weight hanging from it. It clicks gently like a heartbeat. You pause to stare. It's primitive, sure, but it's alive. A monk walks by and whispers, "It helps us rise for matins." Then he's gone. This is the first mechanical timekeeping, quiet, functional, built not to dazzle, but to serve, and its sole purpose, to tell you when to wake up, and when finally to lie down again. Funny, isn't it? All this effort to fall asleep at the right time. By now you've caught on to the rhythm. You feel the day not in minutes or seconds but in sounds and sensations. The scratch of quills after prime, the tang of vinegar at sext, the cold stone beneath your knees during compline. You no longer care what time it is, you care what prayer it is. You care whether it's before or after the midday nap. That nap, so precious, so brief, so perfectly timed, is one of the monastery's few pleasures, and it's guarded, fiercely, not with signs or do not disturb scrolls, but with precision. If you nap too long, you miss none. If you nap too short, you snore during none. Hence, the problem: naps require accuracy, and accuracy requires clocks. So monks didn't just measure time to please God, they did it to protect their naps. Monastic timekeeping wasn't about control, it was about surrender, a kind of holy obedience to rhythms greater than your own bells told you when to start and when to stop, when to speak and when to be silent. And within those brackets, you found peace. That's the beauty of it. In a world of war, famine, and general chaos, the monastery offered a life where even your yawns were scheduled, where sleep was not an accident of fatigue but a ritual, and you, dear guest, are starting to feel it too. Your breath slows, your shoulders loosen, another bell chimes. You don't know if it's for terce or dinner, or bedtime. You just know it means you don't have to decide anything. You wake not abruptly, not startled, just gently aware that something has changed. Maybe it's the angle of the light through the high windows. Maybe it's the faint smell of rye bread rising from the kitchen. Or maybe most likely it's that familiar sound again, the bell. This time you recognize the hour. It's just after sext, the 6th hour of the day, midday. The sun is nearly overhead, and the monastery has entered one of its most cherished and hush-hush periods. The midday rest. Yes, we're talking about the nap. The blessed, holy, structurally approved monastic nap. In the Rule of St. Benedict, there's a delightful little clause that permits rest after the midday meal, especially during the summer months when the heat makes concentration and consciousness a losing battle. You think monks were stern and joyless. Let me remind you, they wrote nap time into the spiritual bylaws. That's devotion on a whole new level. You pad quietly to your cell, a small room with whitewashed walls and a wooden shutter over the window. No mattress, no fluffy pillow, just straw wool, and a surprisingly flat wooden headrest that may or may not qualify as furniture. But you don't need much. This isn't about comfort. It's about rhythm, alignment, letting your body hum at the same frequency as the abbey itself. The monk's nap, usually 30 to 60 minutes, was structured. It was placed between sext and none, those two middle-of-the-day prayers. Some abbeys called this period reclinatio, which sounds more like a Roman spa treatment than a spiritual practice. But the intent was clear. Restore the body, quiet the mind, then rise and pray again, just like clockwork. And here's where it gets strangely technical. See, monks didn't just feel their way into nap time. By the 11th century, some monasteries were already experimenting with rudimentary sleep scheduling tools. Remember the candle clocks? Monks would burn a marked candle, letting it melt down through 1 or 2 segments before the bell was rung for. None. If you were clever and sleepy, you'd learn to angle the candle to burn faster. That's right. Medieval life hacks brought to you by monks, desperate for 15 more minutes. In colder regions, water clocks were a popular solution. Monks might set a small vessel to drip precisely enough to measure 1 nap's worth of time. When the cup overflowed, it tripped a mechanism, or in most cases just made a splash loud, enough to wake the brother napping nearby. Historians still argue whether these methods were common or rare. Some think only a few wealthy monasteries could afford such gadgets. Others believe every abbey had a brother tinkerer hoarding gears and weights in a dusty corner of the rend. This, seller, like some proto-timekeeper wizard. But everyone agrees on one thing. Monks wanted consistency, and they wanted to nap on schedule. You close your eyes again just for a second. The wind rustles through the shutters. In the cloister somewhere, a pigeon coos. Far off you hear someone snoring. Could be Brother Hugo. Could be the abbot. Either way, no one's judging everyone. Naps, even the saints probably. And it wasn't just about rest, it was about maintaining the right kind of tiredness, not the bone-deep exhaustion of laborers or knights or traveling merchants. Monastic fatigue was supposed to be elegant, balanced. You should be alert, enough to chant without slurring but tired enough to resist temptation, which, let's be honest, mostly meant sneaking extra bread or gossiping during garden duty. There's something deeply human in the way monks approach sleep. They didn't deny it or glorify all-nighters as heroic acts of piety. They embraced it, studied it, and designed their day around it. Long before scientists measured circadian rhythms, monks were living them. In fact, modern researchers have found evidence that medieval people, monks included, followed a biphasic sleep pattern. That means they often slept in 2 distinct chunks. One long sleep starting after Compline, followed by a wakeful period, around midnight for vigils, and then a second sleep until dawn. Add in a midday nap, and you've got a rhythm that feels suspiciously like something your body actually wants to do. But monks weren't lounging around all day either. Their lives were filled with labor, study, prayer, and community duties. The nap wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, a way to reset, rebalance, and prepare for the next stretch of divine obligation. And every bit of it was, yes, scheduled. That's where the obsession with timekeeping kicks into high gear. As monastic life grew more complex, monks realized they needed better ways to keep everyone on the same rhythm. You couldn't have Brother Cuthbert napping into none, while everyone else was halfway through the Psalms. That would cause a very polite uproar, so they started developing what you might call the sleep infrastructure of the abbey. Some monasteries posted visual cues, scratched lines on candles, pebbles in wooden bowls, notched sticks kept by the cell door. Others appointed a dedicated waker, usually the most light-sleeping novice, whose job was to make the rounds, gently rousing anyone in danger of overnapping, sometimes with a whispered chant, sometimes with a poke, occasionally with a discreet clapping of sandals. You might chuckle, but this was serious business. A missed prayer could mean public penance, extra chores, or worse, disapproving looks during dinner, which might be the gravest punishment of all. And yet there was grace in the routine. You get used to it, you start to feel the shift between hours, not just through bells, but in your bones. The sun, the sounds, the way Brother Thomas scratches his ear right before Vespers, everything signals the time. You open your eyes again. You're not sure how long you slept. But the room feels subtly different. Cooler. Quieter. Then, like a thread pulled through the fabric of your dreams, the bell rings again. It's time for none. You rise slowly, no rush. After all, this isn't a sprint. This is monastic time, and it moves like honey, sliding down the side of a clay jar, deliberate, glistening, and slightly sticky, if you overthink it. The bell you just heard was for none, the 9th hour, traditionally observed around mid-afternoon, depending on the season and the latitude. That might mean 2, 4, 5 p.m., or just after a second helping of barley stew. No one has a place to fasten, wristwatch, but everyone knows when it's none. The light changes. The birds quiet. Even the bees seem to hum in a more sacred key. You follow the gentle shuffle of sandals down the cloister corridor. The chapel door is already open. The air inside is cool and still thick, with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and centuries of breath. You slide onto your bench, stopped, checking how long prayers last. It no longer matters. What matters is that you're here, and the bell rang, and that the rhythm continues. Now let's talk about those bells, specifically how they got rung so precisely, so consistently, over and over every single day. Because long before clocks became a centerpiece in town squares, or the subject of grandfatherly affection, bells were the heartbeat of time. They marked beginnings, endings, transitions, and moments of stillness. And in the monastery they were place. Absolutely everything. Bells weren't rung at random. There was a whole monastic science to it. The size, pitch, and tone of the bell mattered, so did its location. Some abbeys had separate bells for each canonical hour. Others used one large bell with distinct ringing patterns. 2 tolls for lauds, 3 for vespers, and so on. It was like a sacred Morse code, only slower, and with more birds listening in, and the person responsible for this sonic symphony. That would be the campanarius, or bell ringer. A monk with strong arms, reliable timing, and the rare talent of not falling asleep during vigils. His job was sacred and physical. Many bells were suspended in high towers, and ringing them meant hauling heavy ropes, with the kind of controlled enthusiasm usually reserved for rowing Viking longships. Monks would train for this, not just to build muscle, but to develop timing, consistency, and spiritual awareness. You couldn't just yank the rope like a tavern drunk. Each ring had to be measured, centered, and steeped in reverence. As one the Diva medieval manual suggests, let not the bell be as a barking dog, but rather a lamb calling to pasture. Poetic, isn't it? Of course, not all monasteries had majestic bell towers. Some had small bells in courtyards or hanging in doorways, rung with a short rope or struck with a hammer. But the goal was always the same: to structure the day with sound, to announce time without forcing anyone to wear it on their sleeve. And those bells weren't just for the monks. In some towns, the sound of monastic bells dictated the rhythm of the entire community. Farmers rose to lauds. Bakers timed their ovens to sex. Shopkeepers closed at Compline. In a sense, the monks controlled time, not with domination, but with dependable bells echoing across rooftops and fields. Historians still debate how much influence monastic bells had outside the abbey walls. Some records suggest entire villages synced to the abbey's schedule. Others argue it was more symbolic than practical. But one thing's certain: when the tant bell rang, everyone heard it. Which brings us to the design and placement of these bells. Larger monasteries often had bell towers built tall, not for vanity but for acoustics. A bell ringing from 80 feet up could be heard across fields and forests. The stone walls amplified the sound, sending it over hills, through valleys even, into nearby parishes who hadn't yet figured out their own candle clock situation. And then there was the bells tuning. Yes, tuning. Medieval bell makers weren't just blacksmiths, they were artisans. They experimented with alloys, shapes, and casting techniques to produce different tones. A well-made bell could last for centuries. Some still do. You pass through the cloister now and glance up at the tower. The ropes inside are coiled neatly, waiting for the next hour. The campanarius walks past you with the quiet confidence of a man who's literally in charge of time. He nods just Once, you feel honored, but here's the curious part. All this bell ringing, all this structure, all this muscle, it was originally meant to serve a prayer schedule, but quickly became the foundation for something more advanced, because the more precisely you need to ring a bell, the more accurately you need to know when to ring it. And that's when monks started asking dangerous questions like, what if we had a machine that rang the bell for us? Cue the early mechanical innovations. Some monasteries began experimenting with automated bell systems. These were primitive, of course. No electricity, no gears like you'd find in a Swiss watch. But they worked. A heavy weight, suspended by a rope, might be released at a certain moment, striking a bell without human hands. Some designs included rotating drums, or falling levers triggered by dripping water or melting wax. Was it high-tech? No. Was it effective? Sometimes, but it marked a turning point. Monks were no longer just obeying time, they were beginning to engineer it. You sit in your cell again, eyes half closed. A breeze drifts in carrying the scent of rosemary from the garden. Somewhere below a bell rings again. This one lighter, more melodic. Maybe for vespers. Maybe for a meal. You don't check. You don't need to. Because now in this quiet little world you know what time it is. Not by clocks or calendars, but by rhythm, by sound, by breath. And when the bell calls you again, you'll go, not because you must, but because something inside you has started to move in sync. You're beginning to understand something profound, something that every monk knows even if he never put it into words. Time here is not just a measurement, it's a conversation. A quiet back and forth between the bells, and the body between the schedule and the soul. And yet it's a conversation built on an entirely alien framework to what you know. Because now we've reached the true curiosity of medieval timekeeping. The idea that not all hours are created equal. Yes, we touched on this already, how daylight was split into 12 unequal portions, but let's take a closer walk through it. You step into the cloister garden again, the late afternoon sun draping the sandstone walls in gold somewhere. Nearby, Brother Edric is humming softly as he tends to the basil. You sit on a bench and think about how utterly weird monastic time is. In your world, an hour is 60 minutes always. The same, whether it's July or January, dawn or dusk. But for most of human history, that wasn't the case. Medieval time was elastic. Hours changed shape. In winter, when daylight was short, each day, hour was squished. Barely 45 modern minutes. In summer, those same hours stretched out, like drowsy cats, sometimes reaching 70 minutes or more. This system called temporal hours wasn't just tolerated, it was baked into monastic life. Bells rang not on rigid mechanical cues, but on what you might call sun logic morning. Prayers might start whenever the first light kissed the top of the eastern gable midday, when your shadow looked like it needed a sandwich. Vespers, when the sky went from gold to ink. And yes, this was wildly imprecise by today's standards. Historians still argue whether monks actually kept to strict temporal hours or fudged things with a knowing shrug. Some suggest abbeys used a combination spiritual intention plus practical tools like sundials and candle clocks. Others believe time was often estimated by communal memory. Remember how long last year's sext lasted in August? About 2 songs longer than today, I'd reckon. But one thing's certain, the monks knew this system had flaws. They knew they needed help, and so they turned to tools. You wander into the scriptorium, a young monk is sketching something odd, what looks like a wheel with spokes next to a Latin phrase, hora sexta. Another is sanding a wooden dial with notches carved at irregular intervals. It's a temporal sundial, an attempt to track unequal hours with a static object. Brilliant, frustrating, entirely medieval. These dials weren't one-size-fits-all. You had to adjust them for your specific latitude, and for the season, and sometimes for your abbey's personal interpretation of when dawn actually began. Some monks kept tables, with hour lengths, for every month scribbled into the margins of psalters or calendars. Think of them as handmade time conversion charts. Except, instead of helping you adjust your flight from New York to Paris, they told you how long to read before. Terse. You smile because there's something oddly charming about it all. This world wasn't obsessed with precision, it was obsessed with meaning. It didn't matter if your hour was shorter than someone else's. What mattered was that you prayed, you sang, you rested, in harmony with the day. Of course, as monastic routines grew more elaborate, and as more abbeys wanted to out-punctual their neighbors, pressure mounted to do something radical. Make time equal. That's right. The drive toward mechanical clocks, the fixed, numbered hourly rhythm we live by now, didn't start with merchants or kings. It started with monks who were tired of guessing how long an hour was. In this way, monastic timekeeping became the mother of standard time. Without the divine office, there'd be no motivation to count hours precisely. Without inconsistent prayer schedules, there'd be no push for uniformity. Without naps, you weren't supposed to oversleep. There'd be no demand for automation. That's the great paradox of medieval time. It was both soft and exacting. You were expected to follow the rhythm, but also to understand that the rhythm wasn't fixed. It shifted like the moon, like breath, like faith, and perhaps that's what makes it so peaceful. You sit longer in the garden listening to the bees. Time doesn't press on you here. It surrounds you, wraps around your shoulders like the sun-warmed folds of your robe. You could fall asleep, and no one would mind, so long as you woke for vespers. In a few centuries, the world will swap this system for something colder, crisper, less forgiving. The gears will take over. Bells will be replaced with buzzers. But here in this garden, time is still personal. Sacred, flawed, beautiful. Another bell rings, you don't look up. You already know. You move without thinking now. The bell chimes and your feet follow before your mind finishes asking where they're going. That's not forgetfulness. That's monastic reflex. It's the result of days or weeks or maybe centuries of a life governed by rhythm, not choice. You drift past the herb garden where Brother Alaric is crushing rosemary in a mortar, past the kitchen where someone is feeding logs to the bread oven, and then into the workshop where the real magic, quiet, dusty, mechanical magic is beginning. To hum, this is where we meet the monks who measured time. See, not every monk spent his day copying scripture or plucking leeks. Some were tinkerers devoted not just to prayer but to devices, men with calloused fingers and ink-stained robes who built contraptions from wood, iron, and imagination. They didn't call themselves inventors, but make no mistake, they changed the world. Take Gerbert of Aurillac later, Pope Sylvester II, who spent his monkhood in the 10th century studying astronomy, math, and what passed for engineering. He's credited with reintroducing the armillary sphere to Europe, and may have dabbled in mechanical devices powered by water and weights. Historians still argue whether his clock was more myth than mechanism. But one thing is clear. His brain ticked like clockwork, and he wasn't alone. Across medieval Europe, monastic workshops quietly became hubs of innovation. Not flashy breakthroughs, not Leonardo da Vinci grandeur. Just small, focused tools designed to solve one problem: how to know when it's time to do the next thing. You look now at Brother Benedict. No relation to that Benedict who is leaning over a carved oak table assembling something that looks like a cross between a wheel, a fishing weight, and a squirrel cage. He doesn't notice you at first. His focus is absolute. His hands are steady. A soft creak accompanies every movement. Like the workshop itself is breathing. What he's working on is what scholars might call a proto-escapement mechanism. That's the heart of what would one day become the mechanical clock. A device that lets energy escape in regular controlled bursts. Picture it like a trickle of water through a spout, except it's gravity through a gear system. Genius obsessive. Very monk. The earliest confirmed mechanical clocks, true gear-driven bell-ringing clocks, don't appear until the late 13th century. But their DNA is found here in abbeys like this one, where monks first used weights and pulleys, not to count coins or conquer lands, but to track naps and prayer times. And let's be honest, monks were perfectly positioned to invent clocks. They had time, they had tools, they had silence. And perhaps most importantly, they had need, because waking up at 2:37 a.m. to chant psalms is noble, but missing it and getting glared at by the abbot, that's motivation. These early clocks weren't the tidy tick-tockers you're imagining. They were massive, clunky, and wildly temperamental. Some were powered by falling weights, suspended by ropes, wound around drums. As gravity pulled the weight down, it turned. Gears, which in turn could push a pointer, ring a bell, or in rare blessed cases, swing a hammer that banged on a monastery wall, hard enough to rouse Brother Stephen from his post-mead nap. Others experimented with verge and foliot mechanisms, horizontal bars with adjustable weights that swung back and forth, regulating the release of energy from a driving weight. It sounds technical, and it is. But the concept was simple: regularity. A rhythm that could be trusted. You look over Brother Benedict's shoulder. He's marking intervals on a gear, tiny notches etched with a bone knife. You ask what they're for. He shrugs, murmurs, to make sure the bell rings before Brother Hugo eats the whole loaf. Again, then he chuckles. You both know it's a joke. Probably. And here's the best part. These monks didn't invent clocks for glory. They weren't seeking patents or applause. Their motivation was humble and deeply human structure. In a world filled with uncertainty, where harvests failed, diseases spread, and wars simmered on distant hills, these monks created machines that could say with confidence, "Now, it is time." Historians still puzzle over how widespread these early mechanical experiments were. Some believe they were scattered oddities, rare, expensive, unreliable. Others argue that by the late 13th century, dozens of abbeys had built or commissioned their own clock systems, most without written records. But everyone agrees on the spiritual significance. The clock was born in service of prayer, and maybe in a quieter sense in service of rest. Because every chime that marked matins also hinted at Compline, every rigid moment of psalm recitation carried the sweet promise of a nap, waiting just on the other side of none. You step away from the workbench and feel the faint vibration of gears still settling. The candlelight flickers over brass and wood. Outside, the bells begin to ring again, this time not by hand, but from a rope, pulled by a falling weight, and a hesitant wheel. It works. The bell rings, you smile. The monks don't say anything, but you see it in their faces. They've measured time, and now, just maybe, they've started to own it. The bell rings with a clarity that's oddly satisfying. Not too sharp, not too soft. It resonates through the cloisters, across the garden, and deep into the stone bones of the abbey. And Kof. This time it wasn't a monk yanking a rope with calloused hands. It was a clock. It's not flashy, there's no shiny face, no minute hand, and certainly no little bird popping out to sing. What you're witnessing is one of the earliest examples of a gear-driven, weight-powered mechanical clock, the kind that changed everything. And it all started with monks who were tired of waking up late for prayers and naps. You follow the sound up, a narrow spiral staircase, the stone steps worn concave by centuries of sandals. At the top, inside a chamber, barely large enough to stretch your arms, you find the machine itself. It's a squat, rugged contraption, iron, wheels, wooden frame. A hanging weight made from stone heavy enough to pull down a small goat, and the ticking gentle, deliberate like a heartbeat made of rust. It's the 13th century's answer to divine scheduling, and though it may look like something a blacksmith forgot in the rain, it's quietly revolutionizing time itself. Mechanical clocks like this didn't come with our hands. They didn't display time visually, their sole purpose to ring a bell at regular intervals. To say now is the moment to pray, now is the time to eat, now you may at long last take a nap, without oversleeping into vespers again. You marvel at the craftsmanship. The gears were likely filed by hand, tooth by tooth, and tested dozens of times. The balance achieved not through computers or models, but through trial error, and the occasional divine inspiration, or possibly divine frustration. Some records suggest monks spent weeks getting a single bell to ring at the correct interval. And when it finally worked, choirs sang, bread was shared, maybe even a second helping of lentils was permitted. Historians still debate which abbey built the first mechanical clock. Some point to St. Albans in England, where Richard of Wallingford, more on him, soon designed a complex astronomical timekeeper in the 1320s. Others claim Milan, Cologne, or Sens had earlier models dating back to the late 1200s. But most agree that the concept of a weight-driven, gear-regulated bell ringer was born in quiet, candlelit minds of monks. What set these clocks apart wasn't just their ingenuity. It was their intent. Unlike sundials, which required sunlight, or candle clocks, which required constant supervision, mechanical clocks were self-operating. At least for a while. Once wound, they ticked along unbothered by clouds, wind, or the occasional sleepy brother forgetting to check the sky. And monks didn't stop at simple chimes. No, some monasteries upped the ante with complications, early versions of gears that could track additional functions, day of the week, phases of the moon, length of the day. In some cases even, liturgical calendars pre-programmed to chime differently on feast days. One such device, created by the aforementioned Richard of Wallingford, was reportedly able to model celestial movements, while also tracking canonical hours. His invention, known as the Albion, included lunar phases, predictions, and a gear system so complex it would make a Swiss watchmaker cry quietly into his tweezers. Was it ever fully built? Historians still argue about that. Some say it was too ambitious for the materials of the time. Others believe it was constructed, admired, and lost to fire, war, or neglect. Like so many medieval marvels, but its plans survive. And they point to a mind more engineer than monk, or perhaps someone who saw no difference between the two. You run your hand along the stone window ledge in the bell tower. Below, the abbey unfolds in tidy lines of cloisters, gardens, and dormitories. Somewhere someone is humming, someone else is sweeping. And in the courtyard, a few brothers are stretching quietly, getting ready for vespers, or perhaps just enjoying the sunlight while it lasts. The bell rings again. Right on time. Not early. Not late. And the monks are pleased not because they worship the machine, but because it serves the rhythm. It keeps their world in tune. You think back to your own world where clocks are everywhere, on phones, wrists, microwaves, even toasters. Yet somehow time never feels generous, never gentle. It runs ahead, demands more, leaves you gasping. But here, time is slower, calmer, almost kind. It tells you when to stop, when to breathe, when to sleep, and when to wake. Not because an algorithm told you to, but because the bell, crafted by hand, powered by gravity, blessed by centuries of practice, has whispered. Now it's time. You descend the stairs, each footfall matching the inner rhythm that now pulses through your thoughts. The clock keeps ticking, the gears keep turning, and though the world outside rushes on in this tower, time walks. You don't even notice anymore that moment when the bell rings and your shoulders relax, your thoughts slow, and your feet automatically point toward wherever the next thing is meant to happen. It's not obedience, it's alignment. The bells are no longer calling you, they're breathing with you. And now we arrive at one of the most curious and coziest outcomes of all this timekeeping, the elevation of the nap into a spiritual science. Yes, monks didn't just rest, they perfected it. It starts with the idea that rest was not wasted time. In the rule of Saint Benedict, there's no sense that sleep is shameful or lazy. There are limits, of course. The rule warns against the sin of idleness and calls sloth the enemy of the calm soul. But it also acknowledges something incredibly humane, that the body is part of devotion, and it needs rest to serve well. And so, embedded in the daily rhythm of prayers and work and chants, monks carved out sacred space to simply lie down. Not sprawling. Not indulgent, just intentional rest. After sext and the midday meal, most abbeys permitted a short nap, sometimes as little as 30 minutes, sometimes a bit longer in summer. The monks would retreat to their cells or shaded corners of the cloister, lie on their straw mattresses or benches, and drift off beneath the whisper of a prayer or the distant coo of doves in the rafters. Some monks even had a nap protocol. Yes, really. They would remove their outer robe, place their sandals neatly by the cell door, and lie on their backs with hands folded over their chest. Not because they feared death, but because they believed sleep was a kind of small rehearsal for it. A sacred pause. A letting go. Monks who slept face up were seen as embracing surrender. Monks who curled up were often teased gently for being too attached to warmth. Historians still debate whether these practices were widely documented or simply passed down through custom. Some abbeys left detailed rules. Others let the nap remain an open secret. But across the board, one thing was true. The nap was expected, respected, and protected. And once the clocks arrived, naps became optimized. It sounds ridiculous, but it's true. The moment monks could measure time more precisely, they began to fine-tune their sleep. Not just when to nap, but how long, which candles to burn, which bells to set, which brother had the least offensive snore. A few monasteries even developed wake systems, One monk would be tasked with gently waking the others at the appropriate moment, not with shouting or shaking but with soft taps, whispered names, or by slowly lifting the shutters to let sunlight in. Others relied on automated candle clocks or even simple hourglasses. You'd set the glass beside your straw mattress, nap until the last grain fell, then rise, refreshed, and ready for none. And there's the brilliance of it. These monks who lived without electricity, espresso, or even door hinges that didn't squeak, were living the kind of optimized lifestyle that modern productivity gurus dream about. They were managing energy, respecting the body, structuring effort, and always returning to the same question: how can I better serve the rhythm? You lie down in your cell now just as they would. You fold your hands. The air smells faintly of lavender and stone dust. Through the narrow window you catch a glimpse of sky, soft blue streaked with distant clouds, and you wonder, was this really just about sleep, or was it about trusting the schedule, trusting that someone or something will ring the bell, will wake you at the right time, will hold the day together when your eyes are closed? That trust, that letting go, is what made naps not just allowed but holy. In some records, monks even describe dreams as gifts, a chance for the mind to wander through sacred symbols, angelic visions, or just the pleasant memory of harvesting pears. Some believed God spoke more clearly in dreams than in words. Others warned against dreams that turned indulgent or distracting, but all agreed sleep mattered. And in the quiet of their cells, with clocks ticking faintly and bells poised to ring, monks gave themselves fully to it. Not with guilt, not with urgency, but with peace. You too feel that peace now. The structure is all around you. The clocks, primitive but precise, keep time. The bells, gentle and firm, remind you when to rise. And for this short moment, no one needs anything from you. Not even God. Just rest. Let the rhythm do the thinking. Let the gears turn. Let the candle burn down one more mark. Sleep is no longer a break from prayer. It is the prayer you wake not to urgency but to rhythm. Somewhere outside your cell, the familiar sound of a bell echoes gently across the stones. It doesn't demand your attention, it simply offers it. You open your eyes slowly. The shadows have shifted. The air feels different, cooler now as the sun begins its slow descent toward the cloister's western edge. It's time to rise again. But tonight we're diving into something deeper. Not the physical mechanics of clocks or bells, but the strange, comforting theology that grew up around sleep itself. Because in this world, tiredness wasn't just a fact of life. It was a spiritual discipline. You sit at the edge of your cot, rubbing your eyes, listening to the silence between bells. For monks, that silence was never empty. It was filled with intent. Rest wasn't an interruption of devotion. It was part of it. And that includes napping, sleeping, and yes, even dozing off during matins, though that last one was technically frowned upon. You've probably heard the modern advice: listen to your body. Well, monks had a slightly different. Train your body to listen to God, but also don't be afraid to lie down while you do it. The rule of Saint Benedict is surprisingly compassionate when it comes to human limitations. While it promotes vigilance and discipline, it also makes room for sleep. Particularly during colder months or periods of fasting. There are the 6 references to adjusting prayer times and even work schedules to accommodate the natural rhythms of the monks. It wasn't just practical, it was theological. Tiredness was a reminder of the body's limits. And in acknowledging those limits, the monks drew closer to the divine. They saw exhaustion not as failure, but as invitation, a call to surrender, to humility, to the quiet understanding that no one could stay alert forever, not even in the holiest of places. Some writings go even further. Certain monastic mystics wrote of dreams as a second liturgy, a place where the mind, freed from the body, could enter into quiet communion with the divine. Sleep then wasn't just physical repair, it was a space for spiritual visitation. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were formal theology or just a kind of gentle monastic folklore. Some abbots viewed dreams with suspicion, too easily led astray, too unruly. Others encouraged brothers to keep dream journals, a practice surprisingly similar to modern spiritual direction. A few manuscripts even describe monks waking from sleep, walking straight to the chapel and sharing their dreams aloud. Confessor in tones hushed and reverent, but beyond dreams there was the idea of rest as restoration. Monks knew the body had its own calendar. Muscles strained, Eyes grew heavy, thoughts tangled, and the only antidote to spiritual burnout was sometimes a simple nap. You see it in the structure of the day, in the way meals are followed by pause, in the acceptance that even saints, even scholars, even the most determined scribes copying sacred texts, nod off. There are charming records, two tiny marginalia in manuscripts, showing monks asleep at their desks, with little ink blots and tilted letters, betraying the moment they dozed. One famous example shows a miniature of a brother, drooping forward, mid-psalm, with the Latin annotation, Brother Martin, did not make it to Amen. You smile. You've had days like that. And then there's the subtle architectural cue, the positioning of cells built with ventilation, low lighting, and enough isolation to encourage rest, without total separation from the communal rhythm. Monks were not hermits, but their sleep was protected like a sacred right. In fact, some abbeys had rules about waking others, no loud knocks, no shouted names. The brother assigned to rouse sleepers, especially for night prayers, was instructed to use a gentle voice, a light tap on the shoulder or the simple opening of a shutter to let in moonlight. Sleep wasn't to be shattered. It was to be guided. And once awake, the monks didn't jolt into activity. There was a moment, a pause between sleep and movement, a breath, a whisper of prayer, a slow sitting up. The first action upon waking wasn't work. It was gratitude. Imagine that a life so tuned to rhythm, that even rising was part of the liturgy. You stretch now, feeling the softness of the wool blanket, the cool floor beneath your feet. The bell has stopped ringing, but the sound remains with you like a footprint in sand. Another moment is beginning. Another hour has turned, and somewhere in that turning there is peace, because in the monastery nothing happens too fast. Not prayers, not meals, not thoughts, and certainly not sleep. Everything unfolds with purpose. Everything has its time, even your fatigue. So the next time you feel tired, not the frantic kind, but the slow, inevitable tide of true weariness, don't resist it. Welcome it. Lie down as the monks did. Let the rhythm hold you. Let time for once move around you, rather than through you. And if someone rings a bell, let it be a whisper, not a jolt, a blessing, not an alarm. You've likely noticed a strange thing. You don't just hear the bells, you feel them, as if the vibrations from the tower above seep into the stone, into the wood, into your bones. You don't check a sundial or squint at the sky anymore. You know instinctively what hour it is, by the rhythm of the monastery, and that's no accident, because in this cloistered world, time is more than structure, it's sacred architecture, and one of its holiest instruments, the clock, but not just any clock, not one that shows hours and numerals or ticks away with precision fit for stock traders. These early monastic clocks didn't tell time as we know it. They told sacred time. Let's go deeper. The first clocks, the ones beginning to take root in monasteries during the 13th and 14th centuries, weren't built to track the world's time. They didn't care about farmers' markets or merchants' ledgers. They didn't even attempt to measure exact minutes. Their one purpose was to mark the divine office, those 8 daily moments of connection between heaven and earth. That's why when mechanical clocks began appearing in abbeys, they were designed to chime, not display. No clock faces, no hands. Just wheels, gears, and weights arranged to ring bells at canonical hours. And the interesting part, these early clocks were almost always placed in or near the church. Not the refectory, not the dormitory, certainly not the latrine. They lived in the heart of the spiritual life, where time was measured not by seconds, but by sanctity. Historians still argue whether this use of clocks was an intentional theology or just a practical placement. But there's strong evidence to suggest the monks saw timekeeping as a form of worship. Each bell chime was a summons, yes, but also a sacrifice of attention, a tiny offering of presence. You stopped what you were doing, turned toward the chapel, and stepped back into rhythm. Monks even developed special ringing patterns for different offices. Vespers, for instance, might be 3 short tolls followed by 1 long matins, an insistent, almost mournful sequence. These codes became second nature. You didn't need to see a clock. You heard your schedule in song. And when monks finally did begin building visible time displays, they didn't use hours as we know them. Some showed phases of the moon or liturgical feast days. Others used rotating dials with symbols for saints or seasons. A few even pretty, depicted Christ surrounded by wheels, an image not of mechanical control but of divine order. It's as if the clock wasn't just a machine, it was a window into the divine structure of the universe. Turning. Always turning like the great wheel of time in Revelation, and the influence spread. These clocks weren't locked away in silence. As monastic orders expanded, Cluniacs, Cistercians, Augustinians, their tools spread too. Towns that grew around monasteries began to echo their rhythms. Villagers rose to the sound of the burst. Abbeys, Laud's bell craftsmen timed their labor between terce and sext bakers. Kneaded dough to the slow, dependable ticking from the monastery's tower. Eventually, churches in cities began installing their own public clocks, inspired by the monastic model but adapted for civic life. These clocks rang not for prayer but for market hours, council meetings and curfews. Time had escaped the cloister, but at its heart it remained monastic, because even as cities industrialized, even as seconds became commodities, the DNA of timekeeping remained rooted in the abbey's quiet halls. In the bells that first rang not to profit but to pray, you sit now in the nave of the church beneath thick stone arches and flickering oil lamps. The mechanical clock just above the entrance clicks softly. Not loud, just enough. You glance up not to see the time but to listen for the chime, and when it comes it's not jarring, it's soft, deep, almost tender, like someone gently clearing their throat to remind you they're still here. You rise, not because you must, but because the rhythm continues, and you're part of it now. You step outside after the bell fades, letting the cool evening air wrap around you like a worn cloak. The sky above the abbey is shifting from soft blue to amber gray. The shadows are longer. The garden, quieter. The birds less ambitious. It's almost time for vespers. But before that, you take a walk toward the edge of the cloister grounds, toward the small domed building where a few of the more curious monks spend their nights staring at the heavens. Because tonight we explore how time, prayer, and sleep were influenced not only by bells and gears but by stars. Yes, you've guessed it, we're entering the realm of monastic astronomy. You might think medieval monks were cloistered, disconnected from science or observation, but in reality many were deeply tuned to the movements of the skies. Not in the horoscope sense, though. A few slipped into that too. But in a practical, reverent way, they tracked the sun, the stars, the moon, not for fun but for timekeeping. Remember, before mechanical clocks could ring with any consistency, monks needed a reliable guide for when to begin and end their sacred duties. The stars, ever faithful, provided just that. Step into the observatory now, a modest tower, perhaps only 2 floors high with a slit in the ceiling for watching celestial movement. Brother Oswin is here. He's perched beside a long table covered in parchment, weighted down with small stones, his tools, a brass quadrant, a handful of candles, a dusty volume of Pliny the Elder, and his most trusted instrument, his eyes. He greets you with a nod, then returns to his task, measuring the altitude of a certain star cluster just appearing above the horizon. Not because he's charting constellations for curiosity's sake. No. He's figuring out when to ring the next bell. This is what historians refer to as monastic astronomy, the practice of using celestial bodies to regulate the timing of prayers, meals, and sleep. It wasn't astrology, though the lines blurred occasionally. Rather, it was a system of natural clocks where the stars replaced dials and moonlight substituted for lanterns. Some monks even built rudimentary star charts customized for their abbey's latitude. These weren't elegant atlases. They were often just scratched into wood or copied onto spare parchment, but they worked. They showed when Orion first appeared, in the evening, or when the Pleiades were highest at midnight. These events, repeated night after night, became reference points for sacred hours. And yes, monks used this to regulate sleep schedules too. Take the middle of the night office, vigils, before mechanical clocks. How did monks know when it was time to rise for chanting? In some abbeys, a monk was assigned to climb to the tower each night, scan the stars, and determine the correct time by the position of certain constellations. It sounds romantic. In truth, it was probably freezing. But it worked. The stars became timekeepers. Their slow drift across the night sky mirrored the flow of psalms. the silence of cloisters, the slowness of thought before dawn. And this use of astronomy, it didn't just serve the monks. Advanced science, monastic observatories preserved texts from ancient Greece and Rome and improved them with careful observations. Brother Oswin's quadrant might have descended from instruments used in Islamic Spain or Byzantium, carried north by scholars, seeking peace and patience. And the abbey gave them both. Historians still argue just how advanced these monastic astronomers became. Some claim they were merely copying earlier works. Others credit them with genuine innovations, early understandings of equinoxes, planetary motion, even corrections too, calendar drift. The Julian calendar, after all, was getting messier by the 13th century. And who noticed it first? The monks, because when you pray at specific times day after day, you notice when sunrise starts arriving late, or when the moon doesn't match the expected phase. And those small, sleepy observations laid the groundwork for one of the greatest reforms in timekeeping, the Gregorian calendar. But that's a story for another bell. You step back from the observatory as Brother Oswin jots down his notes in Latin. A light wind stirs the edge of his habit. He's smiling because the sky is clear. The stars are where they should be, and the bell will ring. On time tonight. You glance up once more. The first stars have arrived, pinpricks of silver in an indigo wash. You can see how the monks grew to love them, not for their beauty, though that's undeniable, but for their steadiness. When all else changed, the seasons, the crops, the tempers of abbots and kings, the stars did not. And when you're building a life on rhythm, on prayer, on well-timed naps, you cling to that kind of certainty. So yes, before gears, before candle clocks, before bells pulled by rope and pulley, there were just monks, and the sky, and the quiet understanding that sacred time was always written first in the stars. The stars are now fully awake overhead, pricking through the navy blue sky like holes in an old wool blanket. The air has cooled. You pull your robe tighter. And then, right on time, the bell vespers rings. But tonight, as you walk toward the chapel for evening prayer, you begin to sense something new, something subtle but undeniable. You are not the only one listening to the bells, because by now the world outside the abbey walls has changed. Villagers pause. Shopkeepers glance up. Farmers straighten their backs in the fields. Even the baker elbows, deep in dough, seems to measure his kneading by the rhythm of the prast. Monastery, monastic time has begun to shape the world beyond. This is the moment when sacred time starts to seep into public life, when the carefully measured hours of prayer and rest begin to influence cities, markets, and eventually nations. It didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen everywhere, but slowly, surely, the clock towers began to rise. It starts, of course, with the bells. In many towns throughout Europe, especially those that grew up around abbeys, the sound of monastic bells became the day's backbone. Before there were public clocks, there were public chimes. Lauds meant dawn. Sext meant midday compline, meant lock your doors. And it made sense. The monks were consistent, reliable. Their bells rang even in storms through illness, war, and famine. If you wanted to coordinate a market day or summon the town council or just know when to stop working, you listened to the plice. Abbey. Over time, secular leaders took note. And envy. City leaders began commissioning their own bell towers, sometimes even hiring monks to help design the timekeeping mechanisms. Some were attached to churches. Others stood proudly in market squares. They didn't ring for vigils or compline. They rang for trade, for taxes, for tavern curfews. The bell, once a tool of contemplation, was now a civic heartbeat. And the clock, oh, the clock, it evolved too. No longer hidden in monastic workshops or ringing behind chapel doors, the mechanical clock became public spectacle. By the mid-14th century, cities like Milan, Strasbourg, and London were installing massive, ornate timepieces in town centers. These weren't subtle. They were statements tall, gilded, astronomical, sometimes even musical. Bells chimed every hour. Carved figures paraded past stained glass windows. Gears turned with mesmerizing precision. But here's the twist. Despite all their grandeur, these clocks owed their very existence to monks who once just wanted to know when to nap. Historians still debate the transition. Some say the secularization of time was inevitable, that merchants needed hours, not prayers. Others believe the shift was unintentional, that monks didn't foresee their sacred routines becoming municipal management tools. But one thing is clear: time escaped the monastery, and it never came back. You pause beneath the abbey's small tower, looking up at its humble iron bell, so different from the ornate civic clocks you've seen painted in manuscripts. This bell doesn't chime for business. It chimes for balance, for rest, for rhythm. In a way, you're witnessing two timelines. One is sacred, slow, repetitive, woven into the body. The other is secular, precise, accelerating, driven by commerce and coordination. And they both began here, in places like this, with gears turned by candlelight, with monks who counted time not for efficiency, but for eternity. There's a kind of poetic irony to it all. The very men who shunned ambition, who lived in silence, who measured days by psalms, they laid the foundation for modern timekeeping, for punch cards, and alarms, and satellites synced, wristwatches, and perhaps they'd be both proud and perplexed. Proud that their rhythm shaped the world, perplexed that the world forgot to nap, because when time became public, it also became urgent. Hours were standardized, days got longer, nights got shorter. Eventually seconds appeared, measured, split, sold. And somewhere in that rush, the idea of time as sanctuary began to fade. But not here, not tonight. You slip quietly into the chapel for Vespers, where the candles flicker in anticipation the choir begins, and once again you let go. Because in this place, time hasn't escaped. It's still sacred, still simple, still measured. Not in output, but in presence. And the bells, they still ring, not to rush you forward, but to bring you back. The hymn from Vespers lingers in your mind like smoke. Long after the final amen, it hangs there, soft, slow, a memory already fading into the folds of night. You step out into the open air again. The sky is darker now, stars thickening overhead. And in the distance, the last toll of the bell echoes once, twice, then disappears. But not everyone is heading to bed just yet. Tonight we're spending time with someone who doesn't show up in many manuscripts, someone whose arms are sore, whose sandals are worn, and who is, quite frankly, the reason this monastery runs at all. Meet the bell ringer. Officially, he's called the Campanarius, keeper of the bell manager, of the rope's guardian of rhythm. Unofficially, he's the monk with the worst sleep schedule and the best calves in the entire abbey. You find him in the base of the bell tower, coiling ropes like a sailor. His hands are rough, his fingers calloused. He greets you with a nod that says, "Yes, I've heard every bell today too." And as he works, you begin to understand just how physical this ancient job really is. Because ringing bells, especially in the days before automation, wasn't just pulling a rope. It was a workout, a spiritual CrossFit, if you will. Many monasteries had bells suspended high in towers, heavy cast in iron or bronze and weighing hundreds of pounds. To make one of those ring loud and long enough to summon sleepy monks from their straw beds, you had to swing. And to swing it, you needed to haul a rope with your full body weight, repeatedly. But it wasn't brute force. It was finesse, timing, a steady rhythm of pulling and releasing, listening for the arc of the bell as it gathered momentum. Pull too hard, and it clanged out of sync. Too soft, and the sound died before reaching the bell end. Cloister, the Campanarius knew how to read a bell like you'd read a person. Each had its own voice, its own mood. Some rang cheerfully, others complained on cold mornings. Some cracked slightly when wet. Others sang best in fog. Historians still argue over how much of this role was ritual and how much was just practical labor. Some abbeys assigned bell duty to novices or rotating brothers. Others trained a dedicated specialist, someone who could not only ring the 7-8 by wonders bell but also maintain it, tune it, and in emergencies, climb up and fix it. You ask him if he's ever fallen asleep at the rope. He laughs once, but only once. Because if you sleep through your bell, everyone knows, and worse, everyone is late. Monastic time is interdependent. One person out of rhythm throws the whole abbey off. The bread is late. The prayers are rushed. Someone misses a nap. Chaos. So the Campanarius carries a quiet pressure. His job is invisible when done well, and very loud when done poorly. He doesn't speak much during meals, but he is felt like the clock itself. You watch him test the next bell rope, tightening the knot, tugging it once, twice like a musician tuning before a performance. He doesn't use a clock. He doesn't need one. He listens. Out here under the stars, with no ticking hands or glowing numbers, time is heard, not seen. And the bell ringer. He's the one holding the measure. Of course, in some abbeys, especially in later centuries, automation began to take over. As mechanical clocks advanced, gears and weights were introduced to handle some of the lifting. Bells could be set to chime at specific intervals without human hands. In some wealthier monasteries, there were even carillons, musical bell systems that played short melodies for feast days or midnight masses. But even then, the campanarius remained. Because the machines, clever as they were, didn't account for weather, for feeling, for the subtle silence that sometimes called for waiting a moment longer before the first toll. You walk with him as he makes his rounds one last time, checking pulleys, coiling ropes, listening to the wind. His steps are sure. He knows the tower's groans and creaks. Knows which bell likes the rope pulled slowly, and which needs a 110 sharp tug. And in a world that's long since traded bells for buzzers, there's something deeply human in his work. He doesn't just ring time, he feels it. He tells you quietly that sometimes he rings a little slower on feast days just to let the sound linger, and sometimes a little quicker in winter, to keep prayers warm and brief. No one notices, he says, but you think maybe they do, because even in silence, monks are listening. And when that first note echoes across the stones, it tells them something vital. Not just that it's time to pray or eat or nap, but that someone is still holding the rhythm, and for tonight that someone is him. The bell rings again, low, round, steady. The choir begins to gather. You turn toward the chapel, and behind you, the campanarius pulls the rope one last time, just right. As the last note of the bell fades into the night, you step into the still chapel. The candlelight glows warm on the stone. The monks are seated, quiet, waiting. There's something thick in the air, not heavy exactly, more blanch in their sloth. Orate of, org, like, full. It's Compline, the final prayer of the day, the hour of release, of rest. The voices rise and chant low, steady, not urgent. There's no rush here, no tasks waiting after this, no bells until matins hours away, and as you listen, you feel a subtle unraveling in your chest, like tension slipping out between your ribs. But the quiet isn't always earned so easily, because for every monk who made it to Compline on time, there were those who did not. Tonight we flip to the back pages of monastery records, where the scribes wrote with a bit more sarcasm, and where monks were known to document something rarely discussed in sermons: nap-related offenses. You might not think monks would have disciplinary records about sleep, but oh, they did. Tucked among the Latin scrolls and weather-worn codices are reports of brothers who slept too long, snored too loudly, or, worst of all, skipped night prayers altogether. The most common, the gentle art of overnapping. After sext, when the official rest period came, monks were expected to lie down for a short restorative nap, usually 30 minutes to an hour. Enough to refresh the mind for none, but not so much that you entered deep, delicious slumber and woke up drooling at sunset. Brother Bartholomew, for instance, once missed none entirely. The abbot wrote in the margins of the Psalter, he rose not with the bell, but with the rooster, who was also late. A subtle dig. But the point was made. Some monks were chronic offenders. One was known only as Brother Somniculosus in the records, which, if you're rusty on your Latin, translates roughly to Brother Sleepyhead. His crimes: repeatedly falling asleep during reading hours, once during lauds, and allegedly once while standing during matins. The punishment: no lashings, no exile, just extra chores, washing robes, mucking gardens, and most notoriously being assigned as the night waker, the monk whose job it was to rouse others for prayers. A poetic justice, really. Historians still debate how strictly these rules were enforced. Some believe the records were exaggerated, part discipline, part monastery gossip. Others suggest that while official consequences were mild, social consequences were real. A monk who snored through prayers might find himself with fewer duties, or worse, fewer second helpings of bread. Then there were those who fought the system in subtler ways. Some monks were known to nap between bells, meaning they'd sneak a bit of shut-eye during the short lulls between offices. Others arranged their chores creatively to make meditative silence an opportunity to sit, and perhaps, slowly, slide down a wall, and perhaps, gently close their eyes, for just a moment. One brother built a bench in the garden with a slight tilt and a conveniently placed shrub, making it possible to nap undetected behind the lavender. When discovered, the abbot simply left a note pinned to the bench: "God sees. So does the bench the bless. Godna." Of course, not all infractions were humorous. Some monks suffered genuine exhaustion. The elderly, the ill, the novices not yet used to the midnight waking and pre-dawn pacing. For them, missing an office wasn't rebellion. It was human, and in many cases the rule of Saint Benedict made space for this mercy over precision, but still the community depended on rhythm. One missed bell could lead to confusion. One overslept reader could delay the Psalms. And so even fatigue had to be managed. That's why some abbeys developed rotating nap oversight, pairs of monks assigned to monitor each other's rest, times gently waking one another as needed, not as punishment. As partnership, you see, monastic life wasn't about perfection, it was about returning, again and again, to the prayer, to the bell, to the breath, and yes, even to the nap. You walk now through the cloisters in the moonlight, thinking of those sleepy monks who tried and failed to stay awake, who got scolded, who got forgiven, who got handed brooms and subtle jabs in Latin for their trouble. You think of your own naps, missed alarms, too late coffee, the sweet ache of half-sleep in late afternoons, and somehow knowing that brother somniculosis existed makes your failures feel softer, familiar even, funny. The monastery accepts it, the rhythm continues. Tomorrow the bells will ring again, and if someone misses one, well, the lavender bench is still there. You drift past the cloisters in silence, the soles of your sandals scuffing the worn stones as gently as fallen leaves. The chapel doors have closed after Compline. The air is cool and still. Somewhere behind you, a candle gutters out with a soft puff. The monastery has entered its deepest, most sacred silence, and now it's time to meet someone you've heard whispers about, both legendary and entirely real. He's a monk, yes, but also a mathematician, astronomer, engineer, theologian, and clockmaker. His name is Richard of Wallingford. He may just be the reason you're sleeping on a schedule. Born in 1292 in a small English village, Richard's early life wasn't promising. His father was a blacksmith, and Richard was orphaned young. But he was sent to study at Oxford, and to Benedictine Abbey at St. Albans, and quickly showed himself to be, well, different. He thought in wheels. While other monks copied scripture, Richard was calculating planetary movements. While others lit candles, he was designing mechanical escapements. And when he became abbot of St. Albans in 1326, he didn't just manage the abbey, he tried to reinvent time itself, his crowning project. A clock, not just any clock, a device so advanced that it could mark canonical hours, track the sun and moon's position, display the zodiac, show tide times for the Thames, and most impressively model the movement of the known planets. Let that sink in. In the early 1300s, at a time when most people thought time was either before breakfast or after, a monk was designing a multifunction astronomical time machine, powered entirely by weights and gears. He called it the Albion, and no, it wasn't built to impress kings or scholars. It was built so the monks could pray more precisely and nap. Of course, let's not forget the naps. Richard's work was ahead of his materials. The technology of the time struggled to match his vision. Some historians argue the Albion was never fully completed. Others believe it was constructed, functioned for decades, then quietly disappeared, lost to war, fire, or disrepair. But the design lived on, copied and adapted by later clockmakers. And Richard, he's remembered not just as a genius but as a kind of quiet revolutionary, because with the Albion he blurred the line between science and spirituality, between prayer and precision, between the sacred chant of monks and the cold tick of machinery. To Richard there was no contradiction. The stars moved in rhythm, so should the monks, and if gears and levers could help them stay in step, so be it. Historians still puzzle over his writings. Some passages are complex treatises on astronomical orbits. Others are surprisingly tender reflections on silence, humility, and the role of time in devotion. One line stands out: "He who understands the movement of heaven may also know when to be still." You think of that now as you gaze up at the monastery's small clock face, added later, inspired by Richard's vision. It's simple, A single hand. No numbers. Just the passing of light and shadow. But it works. It reminds you when to rise, when to kneel, when to eat, when to sleep. You wonder what Richard would think of the modern world. Would he marvel at digital watches, atomic time, and 24-hour global commerce? Or would he quietly ask, but do you still know when to be still? Because, for all his gears and orbits and equations, Richard believed in peace. He believed in the pause between movements, the hush between prayers, the deep, sacred breath between bells. He didn't build a clock to conquer time. He built one so monks wouldn't have to guess when they could rest. You sit now beneath the stars, imagining the Albion's arms turning slow, deliberate, exact. Somewhere the bell tower creaks, a gear shifts, a weight descends by the quiet pull of gravity, and though the Albion is long gone, the rhythm remains. The wind rustles through the cloister trees like a sigh, tired, content, and gentle. Somewhere above, a window creaks open. You don't see anyone, but you know someone is awake, preparing for the next bell. It never ends, this rhythm. Tonight we step forward one last time, not into history but into our present, carrying the echoes of those monks and their clocks with us. Because whether you live in Tokyo or Toronto, whether you sleep in silence or to the hum of traffic, you're still following a rhythm built however distantly on monastic time. You just don't always know it. Let's trace a few of those threads. The 9-to-5 workday. It's a mirror of the Benedictine division of labor. Morning productivity, a break at midday, a final push before rest. That schedule didn't emerge from modern science or industrial wisdom, it came from a life that prized balance between effort, reflection, and restoration. School bells. Those sharp chimes echo the abbey's tones. Periods between classes. Structured lunch breaks. Recess. It's all strangely close to the rhythm of Lauds, terce, sext, and none. Even that grumpy feeling students get when the bell rings for math class. Monks felt it too. Just substitute algebra with Latin psalms. Even our modern obsession with calendars, time blocking, and productivity tools is a faint shadow of monastic order. You may color code your Google Calendar now, but Brother Odo did the same with chalk on slate in 1234. He just had less caffeine. Then there's sleep. The elusive goal of the modern age. We track our sleep cycles with smartwatches. We download meditation apps. We talk about sleep hygiene, about circadian rhythms, about productivity hacks like polyphasic sleep and power naps. But the monks were there first. Their biphasic sleep patterns early, sleep waking for vigils, then sleeping again, matched what many scientists now call a natural pre-industrial rhythm. Their short midday naps helped maintain focus, reduce fatigue, and align body and sleeping again. Spirit. They even had rules for waking gently, for avoiding overstimulation after rest. And perhaps most radical of all, they treated rest as sacred, not earned, not guilty, just necessary, honored. Historians still explore how deeply this monastic philosophy shaped Western attitudes toward time and labor. Some argue the influence was indirect, absorbed through centuries of repetition. Others say it was deliberate, that the monks embedded spiritual wellness into the cultural DNA of Europe, but there's no denying the legacy. Even the sound of church bells, something you may hear in a sleepy town square or echoing faintly from a hillside chapel, traces back to those early abbeys. Bells that once called a few weary monks to matins, now ring out to call a village to Sunday worship, or to remind a modern city that it is still living by a rhythm it barely remembers. You walk now to the edge of the abbey's boundary wall. Beyond it, the hills roll gently somewhere in the distance, a road alight, a hint of tomorrow. And as you stand there, you realize something both humbling and oddly comforting. The monks didn't try to stop time. They just tried to meet it moment by moment, prayer by prayer, breath by breath. And in doing so, they created a model of life that wasn't about control, but about harmony. A life where sleep was part of worship, where silence was part of speech, where rest didn't wait for permission. It simply arrived right on time with the bell. You head back now toward your cell, passing darkened doorways and empty garden beds. The rhythm continues. Always has, always will. And tomorrow the bell will ring again. Whether you hear it or not, it will be there, steady, soft, patient, The monks are no longer keeping time for the world, but the world is still ticking by their clock. The abbey has gone still, not quiet because the abbey is never entirely silent, but still, a kind of hush that settles deeper than sound, the kind that wraps around your bones and says, "This is the end of the day." You're in your cell now, robe folded neatly at the foot of your straw mattress. A candle burns low beside you, casting golden ripples across the whitewashed wall. Outside your shuttered window, the stars keep their ancient rhythm. The gears, in, the clock tower above tick softly. Somewhere a bell rope hangs loose waiting for dawn. But you're not waiting. You're letting go. This is the final hour. Not just of the monastic day, but of our journey through it. From those first flickering candles at vigils, to the hum of the gears in the bell tower, from Benedict's rule to Richard's Albion, from unequal hours, to celestial observations, we've walked through a world shaped entirely by a question most of us never ask. What time is it? To rest, the monks knew, or rather, they learned over centuries. Through trial, prayer, failure, invention, through naps stolen and naps sacred, through bells rung late and bells rung too early, through starlight and soot and scribbled marginalia accusing Brother Simon of slumbering like Jonah in the belly of the whale. Historians still argue whether monks were the first true timekeepers, but you know better now. They weren't just keeping time. They were keeping space for it, guarding it, measuring it not to control but to understand, to live within it, not in spite of it. And that legacy, oddly enough, is in your life too. Maybe in the soft routine of your mornings, or the moment you breathe before a task. Maybe in the timer you set for your tea, or the feeling you get when the clock strikes an hour, and you still haven't looked at your phone. You've been part of a rhythm this whole time, and now as your eyes begin to close, as your body drapes into sleep, as your breath softens, you remember something. The monks didn't invent clocks so they could do more. They invented them so they could do less with purpose. They didn't design mechanisms to speed the day up. They designed them to slow themselves down, to pause, to rest, to nap. And now you join them across time, across silence, across the shared and sacred breath of sleep. No bells will wake you tonight, not yet. You've arrived at the quietest hour. The monastery breathes, the world turns, the candle flickers, and time, dear listener, slows. So now lie back. Let your head settle against your pillow, or your hands rest where they're most still. No need to chase sleep. Let it arrive the way the monks did, with trust, with rhythm, with the soft assurance that everything else can. Wait, let your breath come slower now. In and out, the abbey fades behind you, but the rhythm remains. You can still hear it, can't you? The faint toll of the bell, the creak of the wood beneath your feet, the hush of cloister air moving through leaves. You carry that quiet with you. There's nothing else to do. No more prayers to chant. No more pages to copy. No more bells to answer. You've heard them all. And the final one, the one that rings only inside you, has already sounded. It's the sound of letting go, of time releasing its grip, and you releasing yours. So rest now. Sleep in the way. Only the monks knew how to sleep. Not as escape, but as sanctuary, not as laziness, but as a return, to stillness, to breath, to time that is finally soft enough to hold you. You are exactly where you're meant to be, and the rhythm, it continues without you, lovingly, patiently, like a lullaby made of clocks and candlelight. So sleep, sleep well, sleep long, sleep deeply, sleep like a monk.